All right, well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our digital version of our Elevate Career Series, Elevate Career Hacks Online. Today's discussion will feature the growing and current career trend of the Great Resignation. My name is Joshua Prue, and I'm the Director of Alumni Engagement with the UConn Foundation. I'm thrilled to be here with you today. I'm joined by my fellow colleagues who are collaborating to bring you these career-focused events throughout the year. Ms. Caitlin Krause, our Director of Alumni Relations from the School of Engineering, Kelly Lewis, our Associate Director of Alumni Relations for the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, and Kristen Luger, our Assistant Director for Chapters and Alumni Networks. Thank you to my colleagues for all their help in putting these programs together and our collaborations over the course of the year. For those of you that are joining us for yet again another Career Hack presentation, welcome back. We're thrilled to have you joining us again. And for those new to the party, we're glad you're here. We hope you find some fun and insightful information today. We have over 300 Huskies that have signed up to join us today. So clearly this is a hot topic that many want to learn about. So we'll get started in just a minute. But before we get our discussion underway today, we want to review a couple of housekeeping items to help you manage your participation today. First, as Kate will also be dropping into the chat now, closed captioning is now available for these presentations. So should you wish to utilize this service, please visit your Zoom toolbar at the bottom of your screen and select the CC or closed caption option to activate your subtitles. Then that'll pop up on your screen and you'll have access. Second, the chat window is open, so please feel free to drop in where you're logging in from. We love hearing where people are dialing in from and letting us know where you're participating. It's also an opportunity there to engage with your fellow alumni in discussions, career chat, whatever it might be, meet some new people and network today. So feel free to do that. Next, should you have any questions, we are asking you to please utilize that Q&A section on your Zoom toolbar as well. This will help our panelists keep their questions in order and in a central area so they can get to them as they come through and as they are relevant to the conversation. If you drop it in the chat by accident, one of our team will probably prompt you and just ask you to please drop that back into the Q&A just so it gets into the queue and they have access to that in that specific area. And additionally, today's session is being recorded. I know oftentimes work, life, everything gets in the way. So if you've got to jump off, take another call, answer an email, you've got to go to another meeting, whatever it is, don't worry, we will be recording this. We will be uploading this to youtube.com/UConn Alumni and placing it under our Elevates channel. So feel free to log in there if you need to, but it'll also be coming to you in a follow-up email at the conclusion of today's event, along with a survey that we hope you'll participate in to help us improve how we can improve upon these presentations and these events that we bring to you, as well as suggestions for future topics that we can cover. All right, that being said, I want to get into today's topic, but first, let's introduce our panel today. Joining us from the Hartford, Connecticut area, we have Elizabeth Urbanucci. She's an Assistant Vice President in Human Resources at Conning. She specializes in compensation and benefits. And before joining Conning, Elizabeth was a human resources generalist with Robinson & Cole LLP, where she supported talent acquisition, performance management, compensation, HR systems, and chaired the multi-site employee wellness committee. She earned her Master of Professional Studies in Human Resource Management from UConn and a Bachelor of Arts in Economics from Central Connecticut State University. She also holds a Compensation Studies Certificate from Cornell and a Compensation Analyst Credential, or a CAC, from ERI Economic Research Institute. She resides in Connecticut and is a volunteer with Math Counts, as well as your own UConn Alumni Hartford Advisory Committee. So welcome, Elizabeth. Joining her is no stranger to our career discussions and our career hack programs, Mr. John Brady. John is an executive coach, keynote speaker, and frequent media source on matters related to corporate and career performance. Mr. Brady's current and recent clients span the United States, the United Kingdom, as including senior managers and executives from the likes of Goldman Sachs, GE, HP, Enterprise, Apple, Shell, Aramark, the list goes on. Mr. Brady is a 25-year veteran of education, banking, and technology sectors and has experience growing top talent in line revenue from startups, family-owned businesses, nonprofits, and even Fortune 50 companies. He holds a Bachelor's of Science from in English education from Boston University, as well as a Master of Education degree in Leadership, Training, and Policy Studies, and also an MBA from Babson University with a concentration in Marketing and International Business. That's a mouthful. Both of you are overqualified and more qualified than me. So I will turn this discussion over to you both. We are thrilled to have you all here. Elizabeth, I'll throw this into your court now.
All right, excellent. Well, Josh, thank you so much for the introduction. Thank you for inviting me to participate today in this discussion. And thank you to all who played a role in making this presentation today happen. So the Great Resignation The COVID pandemic set the stage and gave rise to workers re-examining what is important to them and how their job aligned with their quest for well-being, happiness, and meaning. If their current job is not positively aligned with such pursuits, workers are quitting to redirect their energy in a new job, a new career, or in other facets of their lives. This trend is known as the Great Resignation, a phrase coined by Texas A&M University professor Anthony Klotz to predict an upsurge of workers quitting their jobs across different industries. Klotz asserts that workers who were thinking about quitting their job at the start of the pandemic stayed because of the ambiguity that the pandemic brought. But now, over a year later, workers are leaving their jobs, and in fact, the highest quit rate for the month of March was realized in March of this year, the greatest quit rate seen in 20 years. And the Great Resignation is a global trend. The Irish Examiner cited the Work Human Fall 2021 International Survey Report, which found that 42% of workers in Ireland are planning to quit their jobs, while 48% of workers in the UK have plans to do the same. This report also found that quit rates in the US and Canada to be at 36% of workers. So in this presentation, we will discuss the impact of the Great Resignation from two perspectives. First, I will present on the vantage point of human resources and organizational leadership to discuss employee engagement and its impact on employee turnover. Then, John will continue the discussion from the perspective of the employee who might be considering a job change. The demand for talent. The job opening and labor turnover summary issued by the US Department of Labor stated that there were 10.9 million job openings nationwide as of July 31st of this year. Across the country, the most job openings were in the South region of the country. The West saw the second largest number of openings, followed by the Midwest, and finally the Northeast. But despite the demand for workers, there is a short supply of talent across industries. And it is this precise paradox that is granting an assurance to workers to quit their current job because so many available opportunities are out there and the possibilities are endless. Next slide, please. Gallup defines engaged employees as those who are involved in, enthusiastic about, and committed to their work and workplace. According to Gallup, employee engagement assists with the assessment and the management of employees' perspectives on elements of workplace culture. Employee engagement correlates positively with lower levels of employee turnover, as well as greater customer loyalty, better customer engagement, and greater profitability. Gallup says that organizations with high levels of employee engagement in 2020 were more equipped to manage the challenges that came that year. More recently, They asked survey participants, to what extent are you currently looking for a different job than the one you have now? You can see the chart on the screen illustrates those findings. The results revealed that workers looking for a job or keeping an eye out for available opportunities were greatest among those who identified themselves as actively disengaged or not engaged. And there is a cost associated with disengaged employees. Replacing workers can be 1/2 to 2 times the employee's annual salary. Further, if current employees are disengaged, new hires who join a low engaged team may not remain with the organization for long. Disengagement can also lead to lost employee productivity. Next slide, please. So for those of you in the audience who might be wondering, what can managers and company leaders do to engage their team and the organization? Effective employee engagement initiatives are those owned by leaders, expected of managers, and understood by frontline employees. Establishing an engaging workforce with great managers remains fundamental and truly at the core of producing and supporting engaged teams. Managers are also in a position to influence the behaviors that drive desirable outcomes. It's about cultivating an environment that meets the continuous workplace needs of employees to help them turn out their best work. And so there was an article published on Forbes.com in 2017 called Five Powerful Steps to Improve Employee Engagement. And the authors explain how managers can define, measure, and improve employee engagement on their teams by putting employees in the right role and having regular check-ins and talking about engagement. Putting people in the right roles means hiring managers are working closely with recruiters and talent acquisition to execute the same recruitment and retention strategy, a goal united with the overarching goals of the organization. And talking about engagement with your team means being clear in your approach to boost engagement levels. For example, engage everyone not only in the dialogue, but in the solutions as well. Measuring employee engagement at the team level can unveil best practices, areas of strength, and areas of opportunity. And managers should be selected, trained, and supported as builders of talent, of employee talent. Gallup recommends assessing managers on their capability of this. For example, set expectations of managers to engage their team. And if standards are not met, what are the consequences for ongoing levels of low engagement? Ultimately, cultivate managers as engagement experts. So I just want to pause right there. I just want to check in to see if we have any questions. Okay, great. Next slide, please. And beyond the employee engagement is the employee experience. The employee experience is a total journey an employee takes with a company, beginning pre-hire to post-departure. So employee engagement efforts should be viewed in the context of the employee experience. In the article by Deloitte Insights titled The Employee Experience, Culture, Engagement, and Beyond, the authors assert that rather than emphasizing solely on engagement and culture, the employee experience is to be taken into consideration to provide an engaging experience in order to support attraction and retention efforts. Assessing the employee experience should be made a priority. So from an organizational level, the authors present what we see here on the slide: the simply irresistible organization framework. The 5 dimensions of this model are meaningful work, supportive management, a positive work environment, growth opportunity, and trust in leadership. We may notice that some of the categories here overlap with what was discussed previously about the role of management in fostering engagement at the team level. This model illustrates cross-organizational collaboration and communication at the foundation, demonstrating the need for HR and business leaders to work in partnership. So techniques like pulse surveys, open feedback structures can be applied to gauge employee engagement levels of the broader organization. In addition, candidate interviews, employee stay interviews, employee performance decisions, and employee exit interviews are all examples of how to gauge, measure, track, and understand employee engagement outcomes. Next slide, please. And again, let me just pause to see if there's any questions.
Elizabeth, one came in the chat. Mark is asking, since engagement surveys are anonymous, how would you fix highly disengaged employees if there are no clues who they are? Because many people are working remotely.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. My recommendation would be start with functions, start with more micro level groups of employees. And then that way, even though the results still stay anonymous, there could be a better idea of where the shortcomings fall in those particular areas as a first level of insight. So the Great Resignation, according to Gallup, is really about a disconnect, a workplace issue centered around disengaged workers. But before I conclude with this slide, I just want to make a note that a degree of employee turnover in an organization is inevitable. In fact, a positive outcome of employee turnover is that it can fortify and revitalize a company by creating an environment where new and innovative ideas are produced. Ideally, employee turnover should run parallel with a company's overall strategy and with external factors considered, like the specific industry the company is operating in. Is the industry growing? Is it steady? Or is it in decline? So the right turnover rate for your company depends both on internal and external factors. The authors of an article on fastcompany.com entitled "Leaders Are Missing What Employees Really Need" concisely put it this way: know your people, see your people, and make it about your people. Managers should understand their team on a deeper level, a level that goes deeper to discover employees' preferences in what they care about and in what they value. Some employees, show employees that they are valued, show how their contributions are important to the success of the company and the success of the team. And finally, make it about your people. Personalize it, because having a connection to the work means having an emotional interest in the results. So look at how employee engagement efforts can retain talent in your organization, but on a broader scale Evaluate the greater employee experience. Realize the responsibility that managers have to engage their team, and have it be about your people, and intentionally put your people first. So with that, that concludes my portion of the presentation. I will just take a moment here to scroll through and see if any other questions came in. And yes, we have one question here that just came in, and I understand your point. The question is, if you are disengaged, would you take time to complete the survey? So I think the key here is we want to get to a place where we're not exercising engagement activities as a reaction. We're trying to be proactive so that should those opportunities come where engagement surveys are released, employees are going to be enthusiastic rather than disengaged in contributing their input and their insights. So another question here is, did COVID just help people realize their priorities and there was disengagement and burnout before COVID? So I believe that an aspect of that is very true. I think COVID, as I mentioned earlier in the presentation, the global pandemic really gave folks the opportunity to evaluate, like I mentioned earlier, what is truly important to them and how their job and their role in their career fits into that and fits into what their personal and professional pursuits are. And what engagement strategies are found to be successful in situations where a large percentage of employees remain remote? I think because a large amount of employees remain remote, and this has been now the trend for so long, there's tons of examples out there and organizations out there who have adapted engagement and team building experiences to the remote environment. So my recommendation is be unique, see what works, see what doesn't work, get feedback from employees to see what they would be interested in participating in, being remote to keep that engagement continuous in the organization. So with that, I'm going to turn the presentation over to John.
Great, and I know there are still more questions coming in from Elizabeth's section. We are going to get to as many of them as we can, but in the interest of the clock, we want to just try to keep things moving. And I'm glad that Elizabeth chose to make a lot of the points that she did. I see a lot of the questions are broadly in keeping with Elizabeth's remarks about employee engagement. And we've been hearing that phrase for a really long time. I'm not even sure how long we've been really talking about it, at least in that way. But I suspect that most people who are in positions of leadership, while well-intended, and at least aspiring to have an engaged workforce, if you get beyond the veneer of corporate buzzword bingo, that most consider it something that's a nice to have, but kind of a distant second to items that often I think appear more directly related to financial results somehow. And one of the reasons we chose to include so many citations in this slide deck, I don't think I've ever done a webinar where we had so many citations in an almost academic way, is that we both gave pretty careful consideration to where we pulled our information. For starters, we're in a dynamic where this is still playing out. There's a lot that we don't really know yet. And we also know that right now in the sort of clickbait culture, there's an awful lot of opinions and a lot of information. These are things that Elizabeth and I deal with on a daily basis, perhaps from different sides, but we see it play out in a day-to-day basis. And in addition to being experts ourselves, we wanted to do something beyond what the blogosphere and doom scrolling and I think sort of message of the moment that's gotten picked up by the mainstream press around this idea of the Great Resignation and people who are at least thinking about making a change or actually making a change. I think for a long time, organizations felt that work was work, and if people could be happy or at least satisfied, that that was more than good enough. But the way I view it in a somewhat sharper fashion, seeing people once when they are thinking about making a change, and definitely when they are prepared to pull the trigger and actually execute on that, constant reorganizations, reporting lines that are excessively convoluted, organizations that are too flat, quite frankly, for the number of people in them, middle managers who are little more than digital hall monitors because they lack hard skills, soft skills, or both, hiring practices that can take many, many months and 4 to 8 interviews that ask the same questions, more or less, promoting people for a 0 to 5% or less increase in base pay, but hiring someone outside at 20 to 25% and higher base pay. Things like using technology as a means of measuring almost like a class participation point system instead of actual output. It all is contributing in some way to a dry rot that's been organizations for a long time. It's been hiding in the books for a long time, that is. And a lot of the moves that can look like savings in an accounting and financial reporting sense come with opportunity costs. And those opportunity costs are just staggering. And the sort of stars aligning around this period of shift where the quit rate nationally for employees generally, but especially for office workers and in particular sectors being especially high, is the first time I think we've really seen something that kind of shocks the system a little bit. While the increased quit rate, this Great Resignation moment, is going to probably continue to generate a lot of clickbait articles for a bit. Most of them are pretty simplistic. And a lot of them, I think, are sort of heralding some new dawn, some sort of gilded age where office workers are now kind of rewriting the rules. And, you know, I remember conversations like this happening after 9/11 about kind of a reprioritization. And certainly there was some of that. But most of those predictions of some kind of permanent change didn't stick, although some things did. Certainly things around security and process certainly did. A lot of things and realignments after the Great Recession in 2008 and the years that followed, there was generally a reexamination. Some of those things stayed, among them a shift in just how long people stay with an employer, even if it is a well-engaged employee labor force within that organization. You know, labor markets swing, and this period of talent migration that we're in right now, it's going to pass, like everything does. The pendulum always swings back and forth. But kind of like the physical that shows an outwardly fit or otherwise healthy looking person through their blood work, that something otherwise is going on that's just beyond skin deep. We're going through one of those moments right now. You get what you measure, and a lot of what organizations have been measuring for a long time either fail to pay attention to, or the right things, or just don't triage things properly. So this moment is kind of a wake-up call, because a lot of people who finally got to take a vacation in 2021 came back from their vacations, and beyond, you know, the usual post-vacation blues, said, I don't know if I really want to go back to work. The top reasons that people cite overall for choosing to leave: the tension over the work from home or return to work discussion, compensation, work-life integration, or broader unhappiness with the work, the workplace, their manager, the kind of engagement things that Elizabeth was talking about. As far as the work from home thing, neither work from home or return to office is really ideal. Both come with trade-offs for both sides, and our time today really isn't specifically about that topic. But I will say that, so I'm writing an article on this right now, this work from home or hybrid model, it's not going to go away. And the reason it's probably not going to go away, CFOs, financial results, are going to drive this. The return on investment that organizations get from Class A and Class B office space, which is basically about 150 to 180 square feet per employee with an outlet and an Ethernet port and some fluorescent lighting, just isn't all that great when commercial leases, standard commercial leases, are 3 to 5 years, sometimes longer. Why carry that on their books if you can push it down to employees to use their own space? We saw sort of an example of this with bring your own device, people wanting to use their own cell phones or chosen sort of technology hardware. And at first, organizations were much more reticent to do that for cybersecurity reasons. And eventually as they caught up with that, they found that moving at least some, if not in some cases all of that cost, if employees were willing to shoulder it, they were all too happy to do it. So I think at some level, this is going to stick around for a little while, and we're going to need to think about how to operate differently. There's also a lot of people pushing on this work from home issue, not just because they like it better, not just because it's more comfortable and it's easier for them. In many cases, they don't have a choice. Childcare is incredibly expensive in this country, and because upward wage pressure just hasn't been there, people aren't making enough. And right now, childcare opens, it closes, keeping up with the pandemic right now. Childcare workers are also resigning in large numbers, deciding that, you know, this is something that has an awful lot of responsibility, but the pay is generally very low. That's going to continue to make things very harder. And in a pandemic that has disproportionately impacted women, women in particular are looking at all of this and saying, I can't go back to the office. It's just not a reality, even when their children are of school age, because somebody needs to be around. So even if they wanted to, it's not always necessarily an option. There's a lot of other stuff embedded in there that at least I hear in my practice from employees who are looking to make a change. And they all sort of fall into those broader categories that I mentioned before. Beyond the work from home thing, everyone that generally when they're talking about the work-life balance, work-life integration conversation, it's in large part a lousy use of technology. We talk about how technologically savvy our labor force is. My opinion is that we're really not very good at it. We tend to treat everything as being of equal importance and of equal priority. We are constantly concerned about how quickly people respond to emails, Slack messages, instant messages, text messages, and then you're back at the beginning, starting all over again. It's a wonder that anyone can actually generate any original work product that adds value to the organization. Not only is it exhausting, but it just leaves people feeling like they're on a treadmill that they can't get off. And that is tied to issues around communication more broadly. I can't tell you how often I hear about someone saying, well, I just sat through a meeting that could have been an email, but I also am aware there are plenty of emails that probably should have been a meeting. We have standing meetings that have long outlived their usefulness, and they're taking up a tremendous amount of time. We're now making everybody not only attend those meetings, but do them by video when audio in some cases may be adequate. Some conversations are serious enough that if they can't be held in person, should be held by way of video. Certainly if it's a performance related discussion or something that's really quite serious. These things happen in the workplace all the time. And it's very easy for people to feel distracted because somebody is not only trying to work on their screen, but their boss is also responding to something in a chat window or the corporate instant messenger on an intranet somewhere. And it's really very difficult. It creates this kind of broader information pollution where no one's really, it kind of reminds me of Pee Wee soccer where everybody chases the ball rather than playing positions. And that's happening in organizations. And in addition to being tiring, it's hard to feel like you even know where the priorities are, what needs to get done, and how. We have for the longest time also been really neglecting the training of managers and leaders. And, you know, to Elizabeth's point, this is an engagement issue. We often read that people will quit their manager more so than they do an organization. Most managers, I've been really blessed to have some incredible bosses that I've reported to over my career. I've had a few doozies, but they were rare. Most employees, it'll be rare, the good boss that they get. I'll even say average. And that's unfortunate. We tend to promote people because of their subject matter expertise and their skill in executing in other areas. And we do the leadership training and managerial training a real minority of the time, and it's usually not something that we systematize in an ongoing way. And it's costing us now in a lot of ways. I'd say probably micromanagement is the biggest problem. It's the most rampant, and it's the one that I hear the most about. And you know, again, we're seeing now just really how bad all of those problems really are and what they cost us. A lot of what's been going on, and this was embedded in a question I saw during Elizabeth's section, there were engagement problems with employees certainly before the pandemic started. This is not new, but the pandemic has really, really magnified all of it for a number of different reasons. For starters, there's been a lot of things going on beyond COVID-19. We've seen political and social cleaves that have brought about some pretty big discussions that maybe only happen in a serious way once in a generation, if that. There's been an uneven economic impact from all of this by sector, by function, by gender, by race. Inflation moving in significant ways for the first time that we haven't seen in a while, which is making a lot of employees say, gee, I mean, aside from the fact that wages haven't moved very much while worker productivity has spiked over the last decade or two, everything's costing me more. I have to look for a new gig. And if the way to do that, to move up by 10, 15, 20, 25% in my base pay is to go to a competitor, to another company, or even make a pivot, then it's something they're more likely to do now than before. Anything that did exist, I mentioned it magnifies problems that workers probably weathered better before. That micromanager, for example, it may have been a little difficult to deal with, but they learned how to manage up and worked okay with it. But now all that push notification infestation have invaded the home like never before. And that makes it all seem a lot larger, and people saying, well, you know, maybe in addition to some existential questions that we're all asking ourselves, maybe it's time. Whenever you have a black swan event, or what the author of that economic theory would really, in this case, call a white swan event, because we could have seen it coming. Throughout all of this, while there's going to be some level of shock, overall churn is going to remain high. But a lot of the headlines that you're seeing about these 50 to 75% plus numbers about people sort of quitting, it's a bit misleading. The non-farm quit rate has been increasing slowly but pretty steadily for the last decade, and then it really plummeted in 2020. And that whiplash that Dr. Klotz, who 3 blocks from me at Texas A&M, saw coming when he coined the phrase, the Great Resignation. He's an expert in what leads people to separate from their employer and then how they handle that separation. He saw the drop off. There was this steady increase for a decade after the Great Recession in quit rate. We didn't notice it as much because it was gradual. And then in 2020, when the pandemic hit, the graph, it drops and spikes all the way down. So common sense, he could tell that there was going to be some backlog of quit rates that would initially cause a little bit of whiplash, but that's not accounting for all of it. We're still seeing those quit rates incredibly high. So those like pent up resignations from 2020 aren't all of it, but because it's still playing out, there's a lot that we really don't know. It is definitely hitting healthcare and tech the hardest, but we're also starting to see it. I mentioned it in childcare, but we're also starting to see it in first responders, particularly in areas like law enforcement, and that has impacts for just about all of us. So while the headlines will talk about huge percentages, the percentages are big and the percentages are significant, but people will entertain a thought without necessarily acting on it. So keep that in mind. If you're the one who's thinking about making a change, because most of us are employees, or even if we're in a leadership position, we're employees too, and we're asking ourselves a lot of difficult questions. When people start calling me wanting to talk about, okay, what the heck do I do now? The first thing I tell them is, look, know your why. Have you really thought through how much of this is the fact that you're exhausted from all of this versus something that's really systemic and that you're really not in an impact to influence or change in any meaningful way? And you don't want to be just running away from something. You want to be able to run to something. Those quit rates, by the way, that we're talking about in this Great Resignation, a lot of people are leaving without a job to go to. And right now, in most cases, that's a pretty good bet, but it is a big gamble, and it's surprising just how big of a gamble, how many people are willing to take. Generally, they've been rewarded for it so far, but we're not going to know when the pendulum swings back in the labor market. But some stuff that you can do in the meantime. First, think about your visibility in different ways. Who haven't you spoken to in a while? Your colleagues within the organization. When was the last time you had a conversation with your boss about what they're being held accountable for? How can you make things a little bit easier for them too? While certainly as the leader, primary responsibility for engagement may fall with them, but that doesn't mean that it's not on the rest of us as well. Anything you can do to make it a little bit easier you might be surprised how much that changes the dynamic. People you used to work with and don't anymore in other organizations. When was the last time you checked in with them? It's just kind of common sense networking, but it's also a great way to get your name out there and start testing the waters and seeing what response there is from the marketplace in the labor market to you wanting to make a switch of some kind. Give a lot of thought to what one author recently called digital body language. And by that, we don't actually mean your physical body language the way I'm showing up on the Zoom webinar right now, but more kind of your overall signature, your writing skills. The tone and affect of all of those different messaging platforms has never been more important. Slow down and do fewer of them, but make them more substantive so that people can more readily assess what is being communicated and the mood that's being communicated in each way. The move toward efficiency leaves a lot of stuff out, and it's often making a lot of people just feel like they're not valued, and it's a little bit easier for them to walk away. Make sure that you're choosing the right medium for those conversations, which was something I mentioned earlier. The other thing is, unfortunately, organizations have been doing less and less with training and development generally over the last couple of generations, really. Each of us has to invest in our own ongoing learning and training, because odds are your employer isn't going to do it, at least not to the degree that you're going to want it to be competitive in the labor market. Because if you start looking, the rules have changed a little bit. There's a lot more noise for you to break through now. While there's a great shuffling going on, there's a lot of great opportunity right now if you want to make a change. You also have to break through all that noise. You know, there's a bit of a double-edged sword with all of this. You might live in New York, but now you're also, because a lot of jobs are moving to remote now, you're now competing with very educated applicants in those remote jobs in other major cities and even small to medium-sized markets. So if you're that person in New York, is your LinkedIn profile, your resume, or even just your value proposition, or as much as I hate this phrase, your elevator pitch, how compelling is that compared to not just all the people in your major metropolitan market, but places like Little Rock, Chattanooga, Boise? If your narrative is really that good, wonderful, but if it's not, and for most people it's not, you're gonna definitely wanna up your game. And one of the things that Josh, before I go to that Josh has heard and others have heard me talk about for years, I make a distinction whenever you do decide that you're gonna make a change in going to the market. Most of the conversation is about what transferable skills can you bring, but also your transferable impact. What is it that not only that you do that you can bring to another organization, a different role, a different type of function, but in what ways can you have a similar impact on cost savings, on top line revenue, on efficiency, on overall quality of whatever? Those are the things that make it a lot easier to bridge and make a career shift or a pivot. And while how to do that is a whole other webinar, a whole other topic that we've covered at UConn a bunch of times before, it's certainly something that we can always go back to or cover again in whatever way. I'm going to take a look in the question box, but and scroll through things. But while I'm doing that, if there are any questions, Elizabeth, that you saw that were more directed to you, if you want to answer one or two of them, and I'll give my voice rest here, and then I'll respond to a couple.
Thank you, John. Yeah, a question came in regarding stay interviews. And exactly what does a stay interview look like? John had mentioned on the employee side to know your why, and I want to flip that over to the organization and for organizations to know why. So for example, if you hear that an employee might be thinking of resigning, or if an employee in specific or an employee group comes to mind, reach out to them and ask them why. Why is it either that they're thinking of leaving, and why is it that maybe they've had the tenure that they've had at the organization, and use that as a starting point. But I think at the end of it all, even some other questions here about what engagement activities work and are effective. I think at the end of it all, it's really about, like I mentioned earlier, knowing your people, know your organization, and know what works for your company and for your industry, and use that as a starting point. John, I'll flip it back over to you.
Sure, I'll take one or two and we can volley here a little bit with the time that we have remaining. There were a few questions around this idea about recruiting, where some of it seems a little bit haphazard. In fact, this is something that I've been talking about a while, and if I were as disciplined as I should be, I would have written multiple articles on this, but I'm glad to see that others finally are. There's a bit of a disconnect. We're seeing how many people are unemployed, but also how many vacancies there are, and saying, well, where's the mismatch? And a lot of it is there's a tendency to hire those who mirror either what we already have in the profile of employees or what we've at least always hired. Also, the sheer volume. Technology tends to accelerate everything, but also increase numbers dramatically. So all of the platforms, job aggregators like Indeed or LinkedIn, or even just your own existing HRIS system, an applicant tracking system of some kind, it makes it easier for large numbers of people to apply. But the first cut that most software is doing is slightly more sophisticated than, third graders word search puzzle, trying to find the right keyword matches and search engine optimization in order to make that pairing. And then perhaps it makes that list of candidates that gets reviewed by a person at some point, or a recruiter going into a platform like LinkedIn and entering some keywords for what they're looking for and pulling names up that way, when there are folks who are perfectly well qualified, having done essentially the same thing, but little things like synonyms, client and customer don't always get considered the same thing by a software platform, by a SaaS solution of some kind. We're seeing a lot of that mismatch where the candidates and the employers are talking right past each other, and it means we have a lot of people who are sitting on the sidelines in the economy who would be more than adequate for what you need. It's also one of the things I try to push as many hiring managers to do as possible is give your talent acquisition people, recruiters, HR people, give them some license to work outside of the box that they're used to just a little bit. Generally, they have learned to just stick with what's there, but a lot of job descriptions have maybe had minor edits, but otherwise not changed in years, sometimes even decades. And it's not necessarily serving you exceptionally well. Most recruiters don't have the time to go out and source talent in the way that a human being could, making some finer distinctions between somebody who has maybe worked with a different type of CRM solution in one environment. They have Salesforce. And they say, well, if you don't know how to use Salesforce, then you're not a good fit. Well, CRM logic is the same in just about any CRM. I've used like 3 or 4 of them. And if you can learn one, you can learn the other. But it's very, very difficult to just put the right words out there that make it easy with this. So really, in many cases, hundreds of candidates, sometimes even more for a single position, particularly if it's a big company, it can easily cross 1,000 for a single posting that's gone public in whatever way. If you can not only be always working on the talent bench yourself, keeping an eye out for folks who you would invite to a search if you found that you needed to replace somebody on your team, but also giving the folks who help you source talent a little bit of latitude to say, if this person doesn't look exactly like this, but they've got some great results that they can speak to, they might be perfect. Let's mix up the pool a little bit. You'd be very surprised. It can be very, very frustrating. And I spend most of my day helping people find and secure positions in areas for which they are perfectly well qualified and probably even have exactly the right kind of experience. But no matter how much keyword optimization you do, it's not always going to match. So a lot of those things are things that we could certainly get better about. That hit like 3 different questions that were in here, and I'll mark them. But Elizabeth, you're round.
Okay, I just want to address here a question that is posed that says, do you think work from home scenario would be defined as a new set of rules? For example, turning the camera off, showing your internet connection. I think a lot of that is to be seen, to be determined. I think that if you were to have asked, when the pandemic first started in March of 2020, how long do you think you'll be working from home? I think no one would have said, it's been what now, a year and a half, that many organizations have been working remote. So I think, as John mentioned earlier, we're still very much in a state of unknown. And I think that the best approach, I think, is just continue doing what you've seen has been successful, and keep an eye on what's next and how you can best be flexible, be ready for change, and yeah, John.
I've seen a few questions about any one of a number of biases in the marketplace. One person has mentioned the issue of ageism, and several have raised others. It's out there. It's mostly unconscious, though, in my experience, but it's a factor. It really is. Also video interviewing and other things which take away a lot of the personalization and the way that so many of us have learned to interact. I just turned 49. I'll just put it out there. The age bias I'm seeing happen earlier and earlier. It used to be that that was something that you didn't start seeing until someone passed 50 or 55. I'm starting to see it 40 and even like late 30s, where for whatever reason, I think most of it is a cost concern issue, and there's only so many jobs that are upper level, and a concern that's going to cost too much. You're not going to be able to compete compensation wise for that talent. Embedded in this also is a couple of questions around compensation and how much leverage people have, whether or not employers should be paying more. There is upward wage pressure right now, and we're seeing it in a few different areas. Again, not all, but certainly in some. I think there's going to be a push-pull on, and this is just my theory, I can't prove it, but the thing I mentioned about competing with other markets, that's one of the big concerns I have with work from home. If geographic differentials go away, where you have to pay a certain amount when you're hiring somebody locally in Boston or San Francisco or Chicago, but now you're sourcing talent from other cities that are far less expensive to live in. Not only do you have a larger number of people to sort through, but that's going to also push wage pressure down. People who are in lower cost of living areas will very gladly take a remote kind of office knowledge work role, work from anywhere, work remotely, and maybe just traveling into the office however often they need to, maybe once a quarter or whatever. Those are things that were starting to shift even a little bit before COVID. And I'm a little concerned about that pushing wage pressure in the opposite direction, unless it's something that's a really highly skilled area, such as nursing, or something that takes a long time to gain credentialing for and qualify for. That right now is one of the areas we're seeing tremendous churn in. A few people asked about different markets, and I think we mentioned this. Certainly healthcare and tech are some of the areas that we're seeing the biggest moves in, but not exclusively. Some of it's more by function. I'm sure you're all aware, supply chain has seen a lot, both supply chain as well as reverse logistics. There's a lot of stuff that goes one way and then has to go back, and someone has to figure out what to do with all of that. So there's a lot of things that are really based more on the discipline than on the corporation that we're seeing a lot of. There were a few questions also about the whole work from home and how much power people have. There's certainly some negotiating power that employees and job seekers have that they didn't have before. I just don't know how long that overall is going to last. If you're in an area where it's hard to hire people right now you have that moment. But on either side of this, and this was, I think, the only thing that maybe Elizabeth and I forgot to actually say outright, but that we talked about as we were preparing for today, waiting isn't a strategy. It really isn't. Elements of this will change, but not all of it. Some things are permanent. A lot of security things changed after 9/11 and they have not changed since. And some stuff has relaxed. But some level of this work from home, work from anywhere, hybrid, this also isn't all that new. In the 90s, I had teams that worked in different offices in different parts of the country. You work for a national or international corporation. It's something you deal with all the time. And that was long before everybody had a video conferencing application sitting on a computer that they could carry around with them, or even have, on these little wafer computers, the cell phones we carry everywhere. and we managed it. But, we're having to do all of that differently. Some element of that is going to be very sticky, and it's going to hold for a lot of the financial reasons I mentioned. So organizations are going to have to invest in their cybersecurity infrastructure. They're going to have to invest not only in the tools that help people collaborate, but in the proper training and just business rules around how to use them, so it doesn't just become more noise that becomes more inefficient as opposed to efficient. I'm also mindful of the time. Josh, if you want, we can take another question or two, or do you want to wrap it?
Sure. If you and Elizabeth can stick around for a couple more minutes, I know there's probably one or two that we could probably tackle. Those that we may not be able to get to, obviously, we can send along to both of you if there's anything that you might be able to contribute. We can send out in the follow-up. We realize people do have places they need to jump. We will be sending out the recorded link of this, so if you want to come back and check out any of those details, or reach out to our panelists at any time as well, there will be the ability to do that. We'll include their employment email, so you can contact them should you need anything. John's is readily available on the foundation website as well. He is the preferred vendor for career and management consulting, so you can check that out at foundation.uconn.edu and select our career resources at the bottom of the webpage there. John, if you want to take one or two more, that'd be great.
Yeah, sure. There've been two or three, I think, that have takes on the whole retirement question. How many people are early retiring, and how are people kind of navigating the finances of all this? Actually, if you look at the age breakdown, and Elizabeth and I were looking at different sources, but we came to the same place on all of this. The greatest churn in this Great Resignation is mostly in the 30 to 45, maybe 50 age bracket. It's increased somewhat in 25 to 30, but not really as much. The older workers have tended to stay put, and certainly the newer employees, they were just happy to get a job, although onboarding and integrating into everything is very difficult for them because they've had to do it in the middle of all of this uniqueness. But for the most part, older workers have not, at least anywhere near the same rate, been resigning or retiring early. And there's probably a lot of reasons for that. I don't know that we'll know all of them. Certainly those who are in a position to retire early have done so as part of this larger, like, hey, am I happy? Do I need to earn what I was earning before, right? Those bigger existential questions. But the macro data doesn't really support that there's been a ton of that, even though no doubt individually there are people who probably have just walked away. Several folks have mentioned, how are people affording all of this? For folks who do not live paycheck to paycheck, a lot of them are in a situation where they're able to rely perhaps on one income. In some cases, it's more expensive to return to work. If compensation just isn't, wages have not really kept up. And given the expense of childcare, the cost of commuting, with there being upward pressure, inflationary pressure, even just in my business, like renewing my basic software licenses, I'm one person. Almost every one of those costs have gone up for me. A lot of recurring costs for me have gone up just in the course of the last 6 to 8 months. Well, that stuff's hitting everybody. And eventually there's a cost benefit question, right? Is it costing me more to go to work? Or if I earn more going to work, is it enough? Or is it only a marginal difference between returning to work versus not? And depending on the situation, a lot of folks have said, you know what, I'm going to have to downsize my life because it just doesn't work any other way. But everyone's situation is different, and it's kind of hard at this stage, while it's all still playing out, to really talk about really big trends. There's not enough time at this hour to kind of go into it. I feel like it's a whole other session, but some folks have asked about the whole work from home and which tools and what are the norms and all that kind of thing that organizations, that people should be considering. The one thing that I would point out is that this raises a lot of ethical and legal questions about now the fact that we have line of sight into people's private residences. First of all, not everybody has like a spare bedroom that they can just convert into an office and do this kind of thing, which could raise some real equity or inequity issues. What happens if you see or hear something in a meeting with an employee that maybe you weren't supposed to, and that could in some way alter your view of that person? One example from actually an employment attorney I know, when she was interviewed for an article, said, you know, what happens if on the credenza behind the person working in their, you know, in their dining room is a mostly empty wine glass that their spouse left there from the night before? What assumptions is somebody making about that? It raises a lot of issues. So both as employees, us wanting to kind of protect our own kind of boundaries and privacy and assumptions and all of that and practices, what do we allow ourselves as employers to see? How do we unsee certain things, and even make sure that a lot of the software that we use in order to track employee time, protect our networks and all that doesn't get used in ways that could unfairly impact an employee review or standing, even if it's unconsciously. A lot of that is stuff that we're going to have to work with and play out. While I have pretty strong opinions and feelings about all of it, they're opinions and feelings, they're not data. Josh, are there any themes, or Elizabeth or anyone else, Caitlin, anybody that run through like 3 or 4 questions that either one of us can answer before we close this? And some of the questions we couldn't get to because there are so many, we can maybe try to get offline like Josh suggested.
I think you hit it on the head when you said that an entire section could be dedicated, or another session basically could be dedicated just to how to retain employees and the types of incentives that could be put in place with the return to work and work from home environment. So I think that's something that our team can take back and see what we might be able to come up with, maybe something down the line that we can talk about as this continues to unfold. But I don't necessarily see anything, but I'll default if obviously if Elizabeth, you saw something as well.
It seems at this point we pretty much covered the majority of the questions.
Okay, great. Well, to everybody who's been able to attend today and stayed with us for the few extra minutes, thank you all so much for your time and for joining us. To Elizabeth and John for their expertise and insight as we kind of tackled this concept today. Obviously, this is still unfolding, so there's more information coming. If you have certain experiences or questions that you'd like to tackle, obviously we'll share John's email so you can reach out to him. His services are available as a result of your status with us as an alum. And we'll provide information on how you can pursue that. But huge thanks to all of you for the time today, for the information that was shared, for your participation in the chat, and for the Q&A. I think that was great today. Thank you so much. And to my team for all their help in putting these together. Huge thanks to them. And we will hopefully see you all, not only again here virtually with another career hack coming down the line shortly, but hopefully we'll be able to see you all in person at events around the country in the near future as well. So thank you, everybody. Thanks, John. Thanks, Elizabeth. And we'll talk to everybody soon.